My name is Stuart Manson. I am a local historian, and I focus and concentrate my historical research and analysis on the Loyalists, the first settlers, the first non-Indigenous settlers in our area in 1784 and thereafter. The United Counties of Stormont, Dundas and Glengarry are known as where Ontario began because the Loyalists, who were originally residents of the 13 colonies, now the United States of America, were first resettled in refugee camps in and around Montreal, Trois-Rivières, Quebec City, and they moved to the SDG area in June of 1784 in a great movement. And the first spots where they deposited themselves was the townships, numbered townships, that eventually became the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas and Glengarry. When the Loyalists arrived in June of 1784, they were really faced with forests. We have the advantage of having documents by surveyors and explorers right before the Loyalists arrive, and they described the various stands of trees, occasionally some meadows and swamps. But what the Loyalists saw was a screen of forests that they then were required to clear to make sustainable farms to provide themselves with a livelihood. When the Loyalists arrived in 1784, they would have been transported, they themselves and all of their supplies, in what are called bateaux. They were shallow draft vessels, open vessels, because the river was fairly difficult to navigate here. And they would have landed here in those kind of vessels. In Lancaster, Charlottenburg, Cornwall townships, it would have been a fairly easy landing, but further west in Dundas County and the western parts of Stormont County, with the rapids, it would have been more challenging to move those people and supplies through the rapids and the portages in that area. The Loyalists would have had very few personal effects when they arrived in 1784. You can imagine the trauma and the dramatic events that they were involved in during the American Revolutionary War in the 13 colonies. Some had to escape their homes to survive with very little of their personal possessions. So when they arrived here, they would have had the clothes on their backs, a few tools and seeds provided by the British government, and every fifth man had a musket so they could hunt pigeons or other animals to help sustain life, fishing rods and fishing nets to kind of supplement their nutrition at the time. But the most important thing they would have had was an axe in order to attack the forest and to clear the land to make living sustainable. Originally, the Loyalists were from various colonies in the British 13 colonies, which is now the United States of America. They essentially chose the wrong side of the war. They sided with the Crown, the British Crown, against many of their neighbors who wanted an independent nation. Many of the men joined provincial regiments or Loyalist regiments, like the King's Royal Regiment of New York that settled here in the SDG area. But they also brought their families, so men, women, and children were settled here at the same time. And I recently found a table from July of 1784 that differentiated the various demographic groups that were here, settled here in that period. There were men, women, and children, but the largest demographic group was the children. So that kind of adds a different kind of element in our looking at the history of the Loyalists, where you have families and the trauma that the Loyalists went through in the 13 colonies, suffering through war and revolution. I can't imagine children going through that, yet they did, and they survived, and they prospered here in the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry.
And why would they have chosen to come here specifically? Like, what drew them to this even end of Canada? Or did they even have choice?
They didn't have much choice in the matter. The British government was desperate to find open lands that were largely unoccupied in order to resettle the Loyalists, because there were thousands of them who really required new lands because they had lost their lands in the 13 colonies, now the United States of America. So there was some choice in terms of Loyalists had the option of going to the Maritimes, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Halifax area, even the Gaspésie area. There was an option for some, but largely they were required to settle with their comrades in arms, their fellow soldiers. The King's Royal Regiment of New York, its 1st Battalion, settled here in part of Glengarry, part of Stormont, and Dundas County. There was also a regiment known as the Royal Highland Emigrants, another Loyalist regiment who settled largely in Glengarry County. But there was a smattering of other settlers here too, mainly Loyalists, disbanded Loyalist regiments and their families, but there were some British regulars, so members of the British Army who settled amongst the Loyalists here at the same time, and even some German regiments. The Britain hired German regiments to help fight the American Revolutionary War, and some of those German soldiers also settled amongst us here, which made sense because in Dundas County there were many ethnic Germans. Loyalists who spoke German because they had recently arrived from what is now Germany. So it made sense for German troops to settle amongst German Loyalists, especially in Dundas and the western portions of Stormont County. The background of the Loyalists was quite varied. You had rich and poor, urban and rural, old and young. It has been said by academics that many Loyalists were recent migrants to the 13 colonies. There's a famous ship called the Pearl that came from the Highlands of Scotland and arrived in New York in 1773, so just 2 years before the American Revolutionary War broke out. And many of those remained loyal to the Crown. They were mainly Scottish Catholics, and they remained loyal to the Crown, joined regiments like the Royal Highland Emigrants, and largely settled in what is now Glengarry County. But the backgrounds were varied ethnically. You had Scottish, Germans, Irish, English, a few French mixed in. There were many people with Dutch backgrounds because many of the Loyalists came from the Hudson Valley of New York, and that colony was originally settled by the Dutch before it was taken over by the British in the 1600s. So you had that kind of lingering presence of many different ethnicities, many different languages spoken. Certainly not as wonderfully varied as our communities are now, but still there was a lot of different languages, a lot of different cultural backgrounds of the people who settled here in 1784. Mortality was quite high, certainly higher than it is now, especially infant mortality. But the benefit that the Loyalists had when they settled here and increased their survivability is they received a lot of supports from the British government in 1784. They were granted lands. A single soldier would get 100 acres, and if he had a large family, if he was married and had a large family, he could get many more hundreds of acres. So the British government gave the Loyalists hundreds of acres of land. But more importantly, they also provided them with food supplies for 3 or 4 years following resettlement. And that was important because you couldn't throw a people onto land that is, forest without providing them with a crutch, a helping hand, allowing them a certain number of years, 3 or 4 years, to be able to clear enough land so they could sow some corn, sow some wheat and vegetables. So that was essential that they would provide those supports early on. And from an historical point of view and a genealogical point of view, the records kept in order to administer those supplies are really important records to tell the story of who was here at the time. We have lists of names and the size of their family for each of the people receiving those provisions. So it was great for the Loyalists at the time in 1784, and it's also a real benefit for modern historians to have those records. The Indigenous people that were here in the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry had lived here and used the lands for decades and centuries before the Loyalists came in 1784. Modern archaeologists have found the remnants of ancient villages, palisaded villages throughout the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry. So we know that there was real usage of the land. But when the Loyalists arrived in 1784, certainly local Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people had used the lands for hunting and gathering. So when the Loyalists arrived here, treaty arrangements took place in order to get the Mohawks of Akwesasne, the village of St. Regis, the local community, Indigenous community, to get their assent, to make sure that they were on board with the pretty massive transformation of the landscape here in Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry. You had forested area that had provided for the Indigenous people for centuries. That was going to be cleared into farmlands, which really had honestly a negative impact on the lifestyles and the traditional usage of the land by the Indigenous people. So there were those early treaty arrangements made where the chiefs of St. Regis assented to the use of the land with the condition that certain islands would be reserved for the local Indigenous community, and also a strip of lands on the North Shore as well that were reserved for their use. So the strip of land known as the Indian Lands is a strip of territory that existed between the townships of Charlottenburg and Cornwall, so the modern townships of South Stormont and South Glengarry. And it was originally part of a treaty arrangement with the Mohawks of Akwesasne that the chiefs of St. Regis, Akwesasne, they assented to the settlement of Loyalists here on the condition that they receive this large strip of land as reserve land. And it remained as reserve land for over 50 years. Largely, it was leased to non-Indigenous farmers and settlers who paid dues and lease rental dues, and those dues went to the community of the Mohawks of Akwesasne. That was until about 1847, and in that year, the lands were released by the Mohawks of Akwesasne, and so the lands became part of the standard township of Charlottenburg. But still, for those of us who have done research in land registries, we know that the legal description of those lands still refer to them as Indian lands. The townships themselves that comprise the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry originally had no names. They were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Lancaster didn't have a number because it was first thought to be too swampy to support farms and loyalist settlements. But eventually it was surveyed and peopled by farmers. So originally the townships had no names, but eventually in about 1792, when the province of Upper Canada or colony of Upper Canada was founded, they were given proper names. So you had Lancaster, Charlottenburg, Cornwall, Osnabruck, Williamsburg, and Matilda were the kind of riverfront townships. The back townships weren't numbered. They were surveyed later and given proper names. But the whole area, there's a issue with the name of New Johnstown. Everyone wanted the name New Johnstown after the original Johnstown in upstate New York. So the town of Cornwall was originally called New Johnstown, but that New Johnstown name was also applied to the township of Cornwall, now part of the township of South Stormont. But the name New Johnstown also applied to the entire area of SDG. So you had New Johnstown here from Lancaster to Matilda townships near Iroquois, and you also had New Oswegatchie, which is closer to Prescott and Brockville area. So there were many different names for our area through that early period of our history. The United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry first had its name of the Eastern District. The province of Upper Canada was originally separated into many different districts. The Eastern District was one. It had an earlier name called Lunenburg, and that's why the first real history of Cornwall and the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry was called Lunenburg, or the Old Eastern District. So it was about 1849 that the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry were kind of unified together as a separate kind of political entity. The Loyalists had a pretty huge effect on the governance in Canada. Canada had become British in 1763 after the 7 Years' War, when New France ceded Canada to the British Crown. But the coming of the Loyalists had a large effect on the governance because they were used to what they experienced back in the 13 colonies, now the United States of America. They were used to having legislatures. They were used to having proper land titles to their land. And when they originally settled here in 1784, there was none of that. The land tenures here were a bit different. It was the old feudal French land tenures where a common settler couldn't actually own their land. And there was no legislature either. So these were things that perturbed many of the Loyalists. They petitioned colonial governments and anyone who would listen that they really wanted the same rights that they had back in the 13 colonies. They wanted patents to their lands, like they had back in their former homes, and they wanted a legislature where they could elect representatives to speak for them in a legislature that would make laws for themselves. So they petitioned many, many years, and eventually they were successful. In 1791, the British government created the province or colony of Upper Canada that granted the settlers here with their legislature and proper land titles. And really that formed kind of the foundation or the basis for modern Canada. Our parliamentary system is based on that original political system that was established here in 1791. Aside from the political, the biggest contributions that the Loyalists made here was really setting the foundation for the development of our area. When they arrived, they had this daunting task of seeing a screen of trees on their allotments. Many of the Loyalists got 200-acre farms, so that was a lot of backbreaking work without any kind of modern machinery. So they set to work, they cleared those farms, and that kind of set up the colony and the future province of Ontario and all of the developments that happened afterwards. You have the canals that were constructed in the 1830s. That was because of all the farms that were here and the ability to move produce to the big markets of Montreal and overseas. That led to the railways in the 1850s, the Grand Trunk Railway being built through the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas and Glengarry in 1855, providing an even better way to transport the farm produce, the dairy products, the cheese that we're famous for here and in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and butter making. And so it really set the scene for the future industrial and economic developments that we now enjoy. The United Counties of Stormont, Dundas and Glengarry are replete with historical sites, from cemeteries, which I have a particular interest in, but also built structures like the Upper Canada Village, buildings that were moved from the flooded area of the Seaway and Power Project from the 1950s. And historical sites are an excellent way for people to really understand history. They're tangible history. They're not abstract. You can go and see the Sir John Johnson Manor House in Williamstown, or the Glengarry Nor'Westers and Loyalist Museum in Williamstown also. These wonderful little cemeteries with tombstones from the 1790s that have existed there for over 200 years. The artwork of a tombstone, for example, shows the artistic carving, stone carving of our ancestors, and they really present a tangible way for people to understand the history. So you can link the history that you can learn in books and blog entries and magazine articles, and you can go there and you can see what they're talking about. And there's something to be said for that from a comprehension point of view. An aspect of Loyalist history that really should be mentioned is the persistence of slavery in our area. It's important to acknowledge that. We often, as Canadians, think that slavery, the enslavement of people, was an issue that was more common in the States. But in the British Empire, of which Canada was a part, slavery was a legal entity. And we have examples of that here in the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry. Men like Major James Gray, for whom Gray's Creek was named. He owned slaves, had them on his farm in Gray's Creek. Captain Samuel Anderson, another prominent Loyalist officer who settled here in the east front of Cornwall, also a slave owner. Now, thankfully, slavery was restricted in the 1790s in Upper Canada and also completely abolished in the 1830s throughout the British Empire, including Canada. So thankfully, we got rid of that horrible kind of institution that slavery is. But it's an important aspect of our history to acknowledge and not to whitewash, and to acknowledge that part of our history. Darren, do you mind if I stay and listen?
Yes, I do. My God, just kidding.
Have a seat.
No, I like Stuart.
I promise not to make me that one.
I'm Darren Bonaparte. I'm from Akwesasne, and I've been researching Akwesasne's history for the last 32 years. It's pretty much the story of, the Mohawks were already here. The Akwesasne people had been here in the St. Lawrence River Valley for about a century and had been lured here to be a part of the colony of New France, to be a part of the fur trade, and to get away from the colonization that was happening in our old homeland, which would have been on the other side of the Adirondack Mountains from us. So we were very familiar with this whole region because of the Adirondack Mountains, the rivers that descend from the northern part of the Adirondacks all converge with the St. Lawrence within 14 miles of each other. So this was a prime hunting ground, a great place to fish, to spear, to build weirs, to do whatever you needed to do. There was ample resources, so it was a prime place to locate. And our people used to use those rivers to travel south to get to the old Mohawk homeland. And so the Akwesasne region, which is not just where the community is, but the whole region, both sides of the river, was our turf. So after the American Revolution ended and those loyalists start showing up with their surveyors and start setting up camp, our people were aware of that from the very beginning and inquired what were they doing there. And when we were informed, well, the British has divided up this whole northern shore of the St. Lawrence River Valley, and you're going to have new neighbors. They're the old loyalists from New York State. And many of them we already knew. For instance, Sir John Johnson and some of those officers that were part of his regiment that got the choice waterfront properties. These were people that we knew from the war because our people fought in the American Revolution. At least 100 of our warriors were part of the campaign to drive the Americans out of the Montreal area right at the very beginning of the conflict. And that gets left out out of the history books quite a bit. But the Americans invaded the Montreal area before they even signed their Declaration of Independence. And so our people were brought in to defend the British interests, and up to 100 of our warriors. And that's a huge amount of our population because the village itself couldn't have been more than about 300 people. So to send 100 of your men to fight, it shows a commitment. So that was a landscape that after the war, when Sir John shows up with his regiments, and I don't even know if Sir John was actually here present at the time, but we were aware of these people. We knew them. We had fought with them on their side, but we weren't about to just roll over and let them set up shop. So we wanted to know, hey, when did our chiefs agree to this? And it turns out they didn't even know that this was happening. And we opposed it. We knew that having a new settlement right across the river from us was problematic. And so the British called upon Joseph Brant, who was another one of those Mohawk veterans who had fought on the side of the British, who was now living in Canada too. Well, he intervened on their behalf and came in and talked to the chiefs and said, I think Joseph Brant was very pragmatic. And he probably told our people, you're not going to drive them out. They're here, but we can work out a deal. Because that's the way those old officers, those old Mohawk combatants that had fought in the wars, they were very pragmatic. And they knew the writing was on the wall. So Joseph in particular said, you can make a deal for yourself here if you play your cards right. So they agreed. They said, we'll allow the settlement as long as our access through their new settlements is respected. So they delineated a tract of land. It goes from Grays Creek out past Glenwalter, where all that is today. And so between Grays Creek and Glenwalter was a tract that went up towards Maxville, where Maxville is now. So that was a route for our people to access, to go to our old hunting grounds or trading partners or whatever. So it was a bit of a compromise. Supposedly, Joseph Brant had even talked the chiefs into giving Cornwall Island to New Johnstown. For some reason that didn't actually take place. Joseph Brant managed to come and talk to our chiefs and work out a good compromise to allow the settlement of New Johnstown, as long as we had access to our hunting grounds, and we had a route that went towards the Ottawa River, and we wanted to protect that and didn't want anybody living there, because sometimes when you have an arrangement, the actual people that end up living in the area don't know of the arrangement, and there's always going to be some potential conflict. So they managed to work out a compromise, and it's kind of interesting that why did Sir John choose, besides the close proximity of Akwesasne, why did he choose this particular tract? And it's possible that it has something to do with his father, Sir William Johnson. Back during the 7 Years' War, during the conquest in the summer of 1760, Sir William Johnson and General Geoffrey Amherst were coming from Lake Ontario, heading down the St. Lawrence River they had about probably 11,000 troops with them and about 700 Iroquois warriors. And so they camped out at what came to be known as Johnson's Point, but was probably right where the bridge to Cornwall Island is, that little area that's now Lamoureux Park. Well, it was completely different back in those days, but that's where the British camped out as they were on their way to Montreal. So Sir William Johnson, with his native warriors, left the main encampment and came to St. Regis Village and negotiated and said, well, we're on our way to Montreal, and thank you for not firing upon us, but, there's a neutrality that's been declared, and we hope you respect it. And not only did we respect that, but 10 of our guys jumped in their boats. So from that point on, we were no longer French allies, we were British allies, because we saw that the British were going to win. They outnumber the French. And we'd heard all about all of the victories, all of the forts that have already fallen. It was just a cleaning up operation now. So we abandoned our French allies and joined with the British, and we were committed to them from that point on. So that carried over into the American Revolution, even into the War of 1812. Although we wanted to remain neutral, the wars usually result in you got to pick one side or another at some point. So that was pretty much the way it worked out for the people at Akwesasne, is they were always kind of contemplating, what is our future? I know right now we're comfortable with our allies, but sometimes what happens here in North America is determined by what happens across the Great Salt Ocean. So sometimes it doesn't matter what happens here. Whatever's going on in Europe is going to determine what's here. So you have to hand our ancestors all the credit they deserve for navigating and figuring out a way to survive into this modern time. Those people who study colonial history, in particular in this region, probably eventually come to marvel at the reality that our people were able to navigate through tumultuous wars and the change of colonies and basically the arrival of new entities like the United States. We're still here, we're still operating. Many of our brethren haven't. There are a lot of tribes that have gone extinct, that have moved entirely out of the region, and yet we're still here. Exactly where we had a village in 1754, we're there now. In 1754, when they started the mission of St. John Francis Regis, It began with basically the French coming in with carpenters to start building the actual mission. They had a mill, so they're able to saw boards. They're able to be very productive in that way. And then probably there were native people that accompanied them to hunt for them, to keep an eye on any enemies approaching, because it was all wilderness. It wasn't like we're the way we are today with little towns all over the place. It was all wilderness back then. Big towering trees and no humans living around for about 100 miles. So they had natives and French carpenters and missionaries. Then once that was kind of established, more people came from the Gunawaga community near Montreal, which was overpopulated at the time. So we were kind of taking the overpopulation of that community. Also, they were trying to draw Mohawks from the old Mohawk Valley to come to Canada. There was a tug of war going on. The French wanted more Iroquois people, and the British wanted the ones who had left for Canada to come home. So Sir William Johnson, who lived down in the Mohawk Valley, was trying to talk our people into coming back and abandoning the French. And if he hadn't died in 1774, it might have been a completely different ballgame for the American Revolution, because he had that much influence over our people. And the Mohawk warriors in the 1750s and into the 1770s were a combination of their old traditional fighting abilities. They would basically strip down to almost nothing and be covered in war paint, which is a mix of bear grease and different colors, red ochre, black, different green and blue or whatever. And they would just cover themselves in that and fight that way. And that's when you're doing hand-to-hand combat with somebody who's next to naked, covered in grease, and you're standing there in a big full wool outfit, the naked guy's going to win. So they also, on the other hand, carried with them muskets, just like their French and English counterparts. They also had tomahawks. They had swords. They had big spikes on poles. So they had a hybrid tactical thing going on. They had their old native style of ambushing people, plus they had muskets, gunpowder, knives, you name it. So they had bladed instruments, and they were a terror. The other troops were absolutely terrified if they thought they were going to be facing natives. The officers, on the other hand, didn't respect their abilities. The officers had kind of hoped the natives would just follow orders, and march into a battle that you may not win. Native people were like, nope, we're outnumbered, we're not going to go. We'll just get killed. We can't risk that. So they called their own shots at every given battle. And so that used to drive the officers crazy, that they couldn't always count on the natives to just do or die. Because, we didn't see our people as expendable. Even our young warriors, we thought, well, they still have a future ahead of them. They're going to be hunters, providers. They're going to have to raise families. Do we risk them? No, we don't. We're going to be very judicious about how we use our manpower. So the officers, on the other hand, they're like, nope, we want you to line up in a row, go march through that field. So there was two completely different ways of fighting. But eventually, the wisest of the colonials said, we got to learn the way the natives fight. And so you start to see, for instance, Rogers Rangers was an outfit that fought native style. They were likely to go on expeditions the same way we did. They would ambush people and use terror tactics. They would even paint up as natives sometimes and hoot and holler in the woods. So they kind of learned our scare tactics. So we changed the colonists as much as they changed us. There was And that's probably one of the reasons why the American colonists thought they could make a break from Great Britain, the British Empire. Who thought that? Nobody thought they could just break away from the greatest empire on the planet. But for some reason, the Americans got enough chutzpah from the natives that they thought they could make a go of it, Like the Boston Tea Party. Why did the rebels dress up like Mohawk warriors? It wasn't because there was a sale at the ye old costume shop of native costumes. No, it was because the natives represented like a primal force of the land. And so the rebels, as I call them, wanted to identify with that. They wanted to have that mystique, that they wanted to have that kind of wildness, that you know what I mean? They wanted to go native, and they wanted to make this new land they were living in their own. So they kind of stole that the image of the native as kind of like a banner for them. Did it mean that they respected us? Not really. Did it mean that they wanted to build their whole American institutions and democracy based on the great law of peace? I don't believe that for a second. But they did see in a very primal sense that the native people and their connection to the land was going to be something that they would eventually seize upon and make the land their own. I make it sound like I'm pro-American, like in that sense. I'm really not. The Mohawks, the Akwesasne, probably saw the loyalists, the settlers that were actually trying to set up shop here. Once they got past the political problem and the confrontation, and they realized, yeah, we've made a deal, they're going to stay, that they saw them as a market for their own products. For instance, the mission had a mill. They were able to saw boards and provide, materials. I don't have any proof of them actually buying from them, but it was an actual little hub for the local area. So also, our people were hunters, might have offered them some of the things that we were hunting, some pelts or food. We're also great at fishing and trapping, so we could have been providing foodstuffs for people. Also, we were planting corn, a lot of things that we were already doing and doing very well that would have benefited the colonists. All they needed to do was just come and talk to us, and we would have probably provided as much as we could. Because our people we were already doing that. We were already taking stuff to Montreal. So this was suddenly a market that had just opened up locally. So in a way, we probably realized that was probably to our benefit, that we had people able, and then we could go and buy materials that they might have to sell, because they were going to eventually have a supply circuit too, just like everybody else. So probably saw them as potential trading partners, people to, hey, I'm just going to say it, marry. People like to bring new blood in, and they weren't always particular about what kind of people, that if they saw somebody that they got along with, next thing you know, they might be married to them. Who knows? So there were all these different things. And the native people materially were actually very well-to-do. In fact, I think it was the wife of General John Graves Simcoe who noted the type of houses that we were building, that they said the houses of the natives are actually better than some of the colonists that we know of. They had glass plain windows and, bricks, and even, all the tools that the colonists had, natives seemed to be enjoying themselves. So, like I said, we were people that took in new things all the time. We kept a lot of things of our own culture. We maintained quite a bit, but also brought new things in as we saw fit. So these were a very pragmatic people that the colonists encountered at Akwesasne. And a lot of them spoke French. Before, our people were known to speak English in addition to Mohawk, more likely to speak French. So it was like probably a bit of a culture shock for some of the colonists, but others had actually known Mohawks from living in the Mohawk Valley. A lot of the loyalists that settled up and down the St. Lawrence River were from New York State that had quite a bit of native population. So they probably were familiar to a certain extent, but, got to know the specific people at Akwesasne. It wouldn't have taken very long for people to be mixing it up that way.
Could you tell us, through the Loyalists' arrival and that interchange of goods, what was the impact of the technology of the Mohawk people that would have influenced them, whether it was agricultural, hunting? Were there pieces specifically that you wanted to highlight that had influenced either their architecture? You've spoken a bit about the architecture, which is amazing. I had no idea. Were there any other influencing pieces of innovation that they brought that was then shared that you would still see today?
Well, I think people were probably already exposed to a lot of the material culture going both ways. For instance, snowshoes, toboggans, different things like that. And then later on, lacrosse, for instance. We were always playing lacrosse. I don't need to describe what lacrosse looks like, so everybody knows about it today. But that was one thing that kind of came along later, was when the colonists, I should call them Canadians at this time, because now it's basically that's what they are. They're a whole new country. Is they embraced lacrosse as their national sport. And so our people taught them that, and our people provided the sticks. Akwesasne was famous for being the source of the wooden lacrosse sticks that everybody was so, excited about. So that's kind of led from the colonial times into the modern era, and is still, one of the big connecting things between our people. So there's that. And it went both ways, like I said. A lot of the European culture was working its way into the indigenous community, for good or bad. And so that's just been an ongoing process. So it's kind of hard to delineate at some point what's truly native and what's from outside, because it all starts to blow together after a while. So it's kind of funny when I think about history, is that sometimes you get people that look at the native experience as just a calamity, that we were just the pure victims of everything that happened. Colonization happened to us. We were the victims of it. It's not quite that simple. The Mohawks in particular, my branch of people, we weren't passive victims of history. We were active. We had agency. We made decisions and we lived with them, for good or bad. And we didn't sit around and whine and cry about bad decisions we made. We tried to figure out a good way going forward. And so today, in the modern world, people want to look back on the past with a very polarized lens of, you're either the colonizer or you're the colonized. And I don't see it as that simple, either you're this or that. Especially with my people, is that we tried to figure out what was the best way for us as a people. And that made for some pretty dicey decisions along the way. Sometimes history, we actually are perpetrators of some pretty dark times in our past. I encounter all of that. I encounter the good, the bad, and the ugly of our history. And at the same time, though, I don't ever come away from it so deeply ashamed or embarrassed or anything. I'm just looking at those people and thinking, wow, what tough decisions they had to make. We can't even imagine what life was like, you know. And I think a lot of times people today, especially in the history game, some people come into it and they're kind of fixated on the trappings of the material culture of the past, and like the frilly laces and the big cuffs and the pointy hats and the white powdered wigs, and they get caught up in that romance of the past. But the reality of daily life was brutal. And people today don't realize that even those guys with the pointy hats had to make some real tough decisions, and they didn't live very long. There was barely any medicine to make any real impact on. You could cut your hand on a blade that you're using as a tool, and you're dead in a month. You're young women, 14 years old, probably married to an old codger. Do we want to run back to that romantic past? I don't think so. So that's what I try to bring, is the native perspective of that, of saying, yes, there was a lot of hooting and hollering in the woods and having a grand old time of it, but there was also a time of where epidemic diseases came in and just wiped out hundreds of people. We lost 111 people in one epidemic disease in 1832. Cholera swept through our village. And in 1849, we had smallpox. 500 people at Akwesasne got smallpox one summer. So you do have these wonderful times, and we can look back on it and say, wow, wouldn't it be cool to go back in time? But then there were some other times where we just barely survived. You know, I always tell people, like, history's wonderful, but it wasn't always.
My name is Bernie McCullough. I live in Glenroy. I belong to St. Raphael's Parish. My ancestors, some UELs, but the biggest part came in 1786 in that migration. I'm involved at the Glengarry Historical Society, the Parish of St. Raphael's, and the Norwesters Loyalist Museum. The first wave of settlers in Glengarry arrived in 1784, when groups of UE Loyalists came from the Mohawk Valley and from other districts in present-day New York State. Their loyalty to the King of England throughout the American Revolution cost them their lands. They came north to British province of Quebec under the leadership of Sir John Johnson, who was the son of New York great colonial land baron Sir William Johnson. They now, once again, were to carve simple homes in the wilderness and clear the forest for farmland. Britain sent teams of surveyors in the early 1780s to Ontario and divided the land into townships and again into concessions and individual lots. Most of the Loyalists settled in the front of Charlottenburg and Lancaster townships. Many of these farms fronted on the Raisin River and its branches running through Charlottenburg and Stormont, St. Andrews, Martintown, and Williamstown. Sir John Johnson settled Williamstown, which was named in honor of his father. On June 29, 1786, more than 500 tenant farmers and their families sailed from Knoydart in western Inverness-shire, led by Angus Ban MacDonnell and the Reverend Alexander Scotus MacDonnell. They reached the port of Quebec on the last day of August in 1786 and made their way by boat and foot to Glengarry and to a place just to the north of the Loyalist neighbors, in a place they named St. Raphael's. They named it after the patron saint of travelers. These were the first settlers in the county who came here directly from Scotland and who were located inland, away from the great river highways of the St. Lawrence and its tributaries. The first place of worship in St. Raphael's was a log building, affectionately known as the Blue Chapel because of the color of its ceiling. This chapel was built about 1787 and was replaced by the Great Stone Church in the wilderness St. Raphael's Church was constructed during the years of 1815 to 1821 and could hold up to 1,000 worshippers. On completion of this church, in a letter to Rome, Bishop MacDonnell stated that his was a church without equal in North America. After 150 years of service, in August of 1970, the building was gutted by fire. What survives today is a magnificent preserved historical ruin that was unveiled as a National Historic Site in 1999. A cairn in the front of the church marking Bishop Alexander MacDonnell as a historical person of Canada was unveiled in 1930. Soon after the 1786 immigration of Highland Scots were granted lots, other immigrants from Glengarry and other districts of Inverness-shire, including disbanded soldiers of the Crown, arrived in Glengarry, and they settled the county, began in earnest. 1792, St. Alexander Greenfield MacDonnell come to Charlottenburg. 1794, the Glen Elgs, MacLeods from Kirkhill. 1802, Macmillans and other Highlanders immigrated in 03 and 04. The later settlers included the sons and daughters of the 1784 Loyalists. They pushed north into Kenyon and Lamoureux Townships, and by 1825, nearly all of Glengarry was a home to farm families and small villagers. The Glengarry population of the early period was predominantly Scottish. With the opening up of lands in Western Canada, many second and third generation Glengarrians moved west or south to the United States. French-Canadian families from Quebec also moved into Ontario and found farms and work opportunities in Glengarry. By 1800, there was a solid block of Catholic Scots settled across Glengarry County and beyond, for whom St. Raphael's was their parish church. St. Raphael's was eventually divided into 15 parishes, beginning in 1833, when St. Finnian's Parish was established in Alexandria. United Empire Loyalist Donald MacDonnell of Glengarry, Scotland, was a young man who came to the Mohawk Valley in 1773, fought in the Revolutionary War, and settled in Montreal as a teacher for a few years before coming to Glengarry County. He started one of Glengarry County's first schools on Lot 1 in the 9th concession of Charlottenburg in 1796 in the present village of Green Valley. Donald was my great-grandmother's great-grandfather. This loyalist, my Donald, also served as Bishop MacDonnell's secretary during the building of St. Raphael's Church, 1815 to 1821. One of his students was John Greenfield MacDonnell of Lot 5 in the 9th concession of Charlottenburg, who became lieutenant colonel in the York Militia and the Attorney General for Upper Canada. During the War of 1812, John Greenfield served as General Brock's aide-de-camp. He lies at rest within the Brock Monument at Queenston Heights, far from the rest of his family in St. Raphael's Cemetery. At the request of Bishop MacDonnell, his name John was given to a newborn boy in the parish, who later became the future Premier of Ontario, was baptized John Brock Sandfield MacDonald. When Bishop MacDonnell arrived in Canada in 1804, there were only 3 churches in the entire province of Ontario: a mission church in Windsor, a church in Stormont County at St. Andrews, which shared a priest with St. Regis in Quebec, and St. Raphael's in Glengarry County. Before his death, Bishop MacDonnell oversaw the construction of 35 new Catholic churches in the province. The bishop was also instrumental in securing British government financial support for Catholic schools. He founded Iona College, 1817, with part-time faculty. By 1826, staffed full-time faculty. It was the first school of higher learning in the province of Ontario. Jumping forward to today, we have 2 remarkable museums in Glengarry County: the Nor'Westers and Loyalist Museum in Williamstown, and the Glengarry Pioneer Museum in Dunvegan. The Williamstown Museum combines 2 stories of Canadian and local history: the Northwest Company of fur traders and the Loyalist migration to Glengarry from the Mohawk Valley after the Revolutionary War by Scots and others. The Dunvegan Museum focuses on pioneer life in Glengarry, with its collection of 19th century buildings and their many artifacts. In the county of Glengarry, there are 25 heritage designations, provincial and national, of historic persons and places marking the county's significant roles in Ontario and Canadian history. Glengarry Scottish culture, as one of the cultures of Glengarry today, lives on with a tradition of Celtic music, Highland dance, violin, bagpipes, being taught and enjoyed year-round. A highlight of the summer is Glengarry's Highland Games held in Maxwell, when many thousands of visitors come to enjoy the competitions of pipers, dancers, athletes, and bands in North America's best Highland gathering. I didn't even mention David Thompson, and I should have. The explorer. He's credited with mapping out 1/6 of North America's mapping. So, and he retired to Williamstown. He lived in Williamstown for 20-some years. So I think it said at the patronage of the bishop, allowed retired astronomer of the Northwest Company, David Thompson of Williamstown, to deal with the agents of the two seigneuries nearest in Quebec, and so to delineate in 1823 the boundaries between the two Canadas, Upper and Lower Canada. Bishop Alexander MacDonnell. He was a big man. He was 6'4". He'd fought in Ireland before coming to Canada. He raised an infantry over there of Catholics, which was almost unheard of. But he was a very persuasive man. And then coming to Canada, I think Britain knew that it was good to have people here to, I guess, protect their interests. And Bishop MacDonnell assured him that that would happen. So, at the taking of, I guess, of Ogdensburg, him and John Bethune, the first minister of Upper Canada in Williamstown, they said that Bishop MacDonnell was heard to say that if laggards and cowards would be communicated on the spot. So they said the warning was probably enough because they didn't hear that happening to anyone. And I get to read his letter books in Kingston, his correspondence weekly, like the who's who of all over. It's unbelievable. It reads like a walking history. His connections, especially I guess with the conservative families, was unbelievable. Yeah, I think probably historians have overlooked a lot of his contributions to the country.
Tell us about his greatest contribution.
His greatest contribution, I would think, well, I guess probably on a religious side, it was just, he formed the first diocese since the Reformation here in North America, in Canada. So I guess that would be his biggest contribution right there.
Can you tell us about why St. Raphael's Ruins is where it is? I know I'd heard one account that had said that originally they thought that was going to be the birthplace of Canada, but it would be the capital.
Oh, I never heard that. I think when he built this building, he probably envisioned it being a cathedral someday. But then when they did form the first diocese, they thought it'd be more centrally to locate it, to have it in Kingston. Much to the disappointment of a lot of the parishioners and Glengarrians in whole, because his family was here, really, you know.
Those early farmers, those Scottish Highlanders, what was it like for them to farm when they arrived here in the 1780s?
Yeah, I guess they were used to fighting, and I think probably the new enemy would be the trees, because that must have been an awful undertaking to, first of all, you know, build their own residences, but to clear the trees, to grow some crops and to feed themselves. That must have been a tough chore. So I guess that's why probably the export of potash was so big, going back to England also, was they had to burn so much wood.
And how long did they have to make their homestead? I heard they arrived in the summer.
Actually, they landed in September of 1786. Some of them would have had some relatives, probably, and friends. Like they were only, what would that be, 7 or 8 miles, I guess, from St. Andrews. And there would have been old Indian trails that they could have, and they would have, some of them likely would have stayed, maybe even in Montreal. I can't see them all coming up in September and being able to build houses. If they did, well, they would have been pretty rough, the housing.
Are there any remnants of some of those old houses that still remain?
There's a few log houses, I guess, on the concession south of St. Raffles. Yeah, and there's a few, I guess, on Frog Hollow, which runs north-south, or north rather, just north of the ruins. There's still 1, 2, 3, I guess, original log houses there.
How big would they be? What their houses have looked like, if you could describe them?
You know, a big house back then might have been 20 by 20. Yeah, and, you know, one story or a story and a half at best.
How many people would live in that 20 by 20 house?
Well, when you look at some of the old records, the families were, you know, usually anywhere from 8 to a dozen kids. So, body heat.
And where would they keep their livestock? Would they have built the livestock
Well, they'd be
first, or would they have built the house?
Well, they would have built lean-tos or small shanties for they wouldn't have much livestock. That would have been, I know, even the first building they likely would have built in the area would have been a blacksmith shop because of necessity, you know, even to make hinges and things for doors and stuff. That would have been, because I remember hearing that the first religious services were held in the blacksmith shop before they even built a church, which probably would have been the following year. Local folklore tells us that blacksmith shop was moved to Apple Hill. And I remember the old blacksmith there, Oliver Hamlin said that it was once the house of the Lord and now the house of the devil because of the heat and everything. But there's a little sideline to that. Some argued in Apple Hill that it didn't come from St. Raffles, that it came from west of Apple Hill, a place called Caravani Corners. Because one old fellow, his dad, who lived to be 100, said it came from Caravani Corners. Everybody assumed that was correct. And one time I seen a painting of a building, and I knew it was a Stuart McCormick painting, a local artist. And so I asked the lady, I says, do you know where that building was? And she said, oh, there's something written on the back. So I took the painting off the wall and I read the back of it, and it said it was a house, Caravani Corners. And the Caravani Corners on this picture was a mile from St. Raffles. So that meant that there was 2 Caravani Corners in Glengarry.
Tell us about the early people. You said a lot of them were Scottish origin, arriving from the Highlands. What would they have been like? What was their influence on the county?
They were good farmers. They worked hard to defend the country. They were right there. Even the uprisings of 37, 38 in Quebec, you know, they formed, I think, 4 militias to ward off that also. They say that's the last time that the fiery cross was used in North America. They lit something on a stick, I guess, and went running through the county yelling that there was to be ready to fight. At St. Raffles, they had the parade grounds just east of the ruins. And I actually found a cannonball, or actually, I shouldn't say I found it, someone gave it to me, just east of St. Raffles. And they suspected probably training and practicing it must have been shot and landed. So.
What would you say the biggest influence the Loyalists had on SDG counties in that early time?
I guess their loyalty to Britain. I think that would be it. You know, when you think only 30-some years earlier, you know, twice, you know, they fought and lost. I think it was in 1715 and then again in 1745, 46 with the culmination of, Culloden, trying to keep the true heirs, the Stuarts, in power. I think after that, and then the clan system really almost ended at that time. And I guess to think that many years later, I guess they were just as loyal then to the Hanovers because they defended, they fought not just in the Revolutionary War, but then in the War of 1812, and again at the uprising. So yeah, I guess that was, their loyalty.
What would you say was the thing that kind of gave you that wow moment? Wow, they did this, or they lived this, or they dealt with this.
I think the biggest thing is when you go through the names, you take David Thompson, you take Alexander Mackenzie, you take the big bishop, John Bethune, the first minister in Upper Canada. They all played big roles. I guess both the bishop and Bethune, not just to enhance and foster their own faiths, but really for the good of the country. There was never any animosity in Glengarry between Protestants and Catholics. They always get along. I think they had a very strong bond because of their Gaelic language and their love of, of things Scottish.
And what would you tell us if you were telling, a friend of what to look forward to at the 1784 event, what would you tell them? Why should they come?
It's part of our history. I volunteer now at the Nor'Westers Museum in Williamstown, and when visitors come, they're really amazed of what's there and the history, and I guess the role that, and the fur trade people, the role they played in this country, the development of this country.